Okay, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see the first slide. So the Procurement Act 2023. That passed in 2023, was supposed to come into effect in 2024, but the Labour government deferred it for 4 months. So it's coming into effect from the 24th of February 2025. So we've got just over a month to go before the new rules kick in. So we're going to kind of explore those. I think the first thing I'm going to say, though, is whether you would just listen to my kind of 20 minutes now, whether you come on one of our 90-minute sessions, they are only an introduction to make sure you're aware of the rules. You need to read the rules, and particularly you need to read the guidance that the government has issued if you are doing a major procurement, just to make sure you do comply with it. So however long I sit here and talk, we are not going to absolve you from actually reading the guidance while you're putting it together, while you're doing your tendering and so on. So what are we talking about? So first of all, the Act applies to tendering in the UK where the value is expected to be above the threshold. There are actually two thresholds that are relevant to you as a parish or town council. The first one, the big one, is for works or construction. So if you are building something new, if you are renovating a building, if you are installing structures on land, if you are leveling or moving land to make a level a playing field or build a pump track or something like that, the works threshold is the one that applies for that kind of activity. And it's a big one. It's £5,372,609, including VAT. 10 years ago, when I would have said, and parish councils don't do projects over £5 million, so don't worry about it, but they do. We have got probably 10 or 12 clients doing exactly that, doing 10, even 15 million, 16 million new building projects as parish councils. So we do see projects above that threshold occasionally. If it's not construction, if you're not building something, if it's buying goods or if it's having services carried out, the threshold is considerably lower, but still very high in parish council terms, £214,904, including VAT. What do we mean when we're looking at that? It's what you estimate the contract to be. Obviously, you don't know what the tenders are going to come in at, and we often get that question from people. We thought this was going to be under £200,000. We put it out to tender, or we didn't put it out to tender. We then got quotes, and the quotes were over £250,000. Do we need to go back to the beginning and start again? And the answer to that is no. As long as you had a genuine estimate that you thought it was going to be £180,000 or whatever, then that's fine. You followed the rules. You estimated what it was going to be, and you just got surprised by your tenders. So what do we mean by that? It's the value over the full term of the contract. That means that if it's a 3 or 4 or 5 year contract, you need to look at what will we pay to the supplier over the full term. So 4 years at 53,726, including VAT, would be caught by being over that threshold. And that does affect some of the larger parish and town councils in terms of their grass cutting contracts and things like that, because they may have a big enough contract to exceed the threshold. When we're estimating the value, we have to include any extension or renewal options. So if it's a 5-year contract that could be extended for 2, we treat that as a 7-year contract in terms of working out the value. If it's a 3-year contract with the right to another 3 years, if we're happy with you, then we treat that as a 6-year contract, because that's how long we will, or the value of the contract we will let before we go back to competition and go back to the market again. So we need to be careful that we are sure we know whether we're above or below those thresholds before we go anywhere. The Procurement Act doesn't apply to every contract that we do. So there are certain things, and most of them will be blindingly obvious, but it doesn't apply to the purchase of land. If you want to buy land, usually you know where the land is or where the building is, and it's in your village or in your town, and it's in a location where you want it to be. So we don't do an open invitation and say, hey, who would like to provide land to us? Because that's not going to be effective. So we don't have to follow the Procurement Act for buying land and buildings. A very, very narrow one, legal representation in disputes. So if you're going to end up in court and you need barristers, solicitors, etc. And again, I would normally say parish councils don't incur legal costs of over £214,000, so you don't need to worry about it. But we have had two parish councils in the fairly recent past that have incurred £250,000 of legal costs, which they should have thought about before they got into. So it could happen, and we don't need to follow the Procurement Act for legal fees in those circumstances. If contracts are between two public bodies and it's not something done in competition with the private sector, then we don't have to follow the full act. You do need to be careful if you've got, and we've had people saying we have a situation where we have an agreement with our principal authority and they cut our grass or something. So if it's an agreement between you because you're two local authorities and you are agreeing to, you each do your own bit and you're working together, that's fine. If it's simply a case of you put in a bid to cut the district council's grass in competition with everybody else, that's a supply of services. You're not doing it just because you are two public bodies. A common example would be, we see lots of situations where, for example, a parish council's got a library in their building and there's some kind of an agreement, and very often it's a bit of give and take. It may be rent-free, it may be reduced rent, it may involve transfers of staff. The only reason you're doing it is because you're two local authorities trying to provide a service, and you wouldn't invite somebody else to quote or put in a bid for doing that in the same way. Similarly, investments, you wouldn't normally go, hey, who would like to offer us investments, because you would get about 1 million tenders, mostly from people that know nothing about investment and just want to take your money. Same with employment. We have a completely different process for employing staff and so on. And public transport, we do know some parish councils that do provide public transport, and there are completely separate regulations if you're running a bus service or similar. So you follow those rules, not the the Procurement Act. The Act sets out some objectives, and most of these are what you really would expect. So value for money, and we know that the current government is really trying to focus on value for money. So you have to think about, how do we get best value for money? It's public money, so maximizing the public benefit. Why are we spending it? What does the public get out of it? Really important: transparency, openness, sharing your information, sharing your policies, explaining how you will make your decisions. It's not something you do in a dark room and don't tell anybody about, and nobody needs to know how you got to your conclusion. That is exactly what the Act is supposed to stamp out. People making decisions that they can't explain and nobody else knows why the guy who lives next door to the chairman of the council got the contract again. Yeah, and it still happens. And acting with integrity, so we don't get what I've just mentioned. There's a general principle in the Act: treat all suppliers the same unless there is justification not to. And as an example, if somebody's put in a tender and since they put in the tender, they've gone into liquidation, it's entirely reasonable to treat them differently from your other tenderers, because your other tenderers are ready to start. Hopefully it should be able to deliver, and they may not be able to. And there is a stronger requirement to remove barriers to small and medium enterprises. So the current rules are, you must consider whether there are any. There is a firmer obligation to remove them. So I thought I'd just put an extra slide at the last minute just to look at this. So this is from the government guidance, which I heartily recommend that you read. This is a page just giving the kind of feedback that small and medium-sized businesses say when they're asked why they don't get or why they don't bid for local authority contracts. Okay. They're not aware of the opportunities. The process is complex. There's an unconscious bias when people are making decisions. Sometimes it's vague in terms of its requirements. Sometimes the timescales are too short. Sometimes there's too much in the middle on, too much investment and staff time involved in trying to put in a bid for something you have very little chance of winning, or perceive that. So, complex terms and conditions which put people off, and I've seen parish councils do this, very complex terms and conditions that I had somebody with a £5,000 project do a set of terms and conditions that looked like they were for £1 million construction or something like that. So onerous terms unnecessarily don't help encouraging small businesses to bid for work. So those are just kind of some examples. And this is just one page of lots and lots of government guidance. The Act breaks down into kind of before, during, and after, so it's quite well structured, and the guidance follows that. There is a whole suite of guidance for each different part of the process. So preliminaries, the government's encouraging planned procurement notices. So rather than just go, hey, who would like to do our new building? A notification in advance saying we are going to be issuing a tender for a new building project at the end of February, for example. So we're telling people maybe 5-6 weeks in front, there is going to be a big tender invitation coming up. We haven't got all the details, we haven't finished the spec, but we want to tell you about it. And that just makes the market aware that there are opportunities coming through, rather than relying on people notice that you've put out a tender and they've only got 3 weeks to reply. There's opportunities for preliminary market engagement, talking to the market, talking to firms to find out what's available. Have you missed any new technologies? How can you solve a particular issue that you've got, and things like that. So you can, if you do that, you're required to publish a market engagement notice telling people that you're engaging with the market. There's a key thing in that. You must try and ensure that by engaging with 1 or 2 contractors to start with, to gather information or to explore the options, you do not give one of them an unfair advantage compared to all the others. So, for example, if they've got more information than anybody else has, or if they've been involved in setting your specification, we've seen this again, they've been involved in setting the specification and they've made sure the specification sounds horrible to everybody else to discourage people from bidding for it. So that's what we mean by giving somebody an unfair advantage. There's also a new duty to consider when you're letting a big contract with lots of different things, to consider whether to split it into lots. So instead of letting it as £1 million contract, it might be 10 lots of £100,000, for example, so smaller businesses can bid for it. We have an example of that in the local council sector. The external audit contract is let in lots. Those lots happen to be the size and shape of whatever county you're in, but the bidders, the audit firms, choose which counties to bid for, what sort of price they're going to do, and it may be driven on their availability, where their staff are based, and so on. So that's an example of how we do something by lots. When we want the same thing done in different places, we don't mind who does it as long as it gets done. And probably one of the bigger changes is a change in procedures. We used to have 5 different procedures depending on how you wanted to run your tender process. We now have 2. It's an either or. So, and the standard is an open process. It's a 1-step, no restriction. You publish an advert, says who would like to build our building, who would like to cut our grass, with all the information, and somebody tenders for that activity. It's a 1-step process. So if you get 150 tenders, you then have to sift through and work out how you're going to narrow those down. But there are no restrictions, no steps to reduce the number of people who are allowed to put forward a bid. The alternative is basically anything else, and it's called the competitive flexible process, which allows you to insert multiple stages. So you might have a stage where everybody bids and you pick 10 that go forward and then narrow it down to your last 3 or something like that. Or you may want further information first or something like that, or you may want to restrict certain kinds of people in terms of who can bid. Anything that is restricted rather than an open who would like to bid is the competitive flexible process, and you need to make sure you comply with the rules and follow the guidance if you're going to pick that as an approach. And those are more likely where it's a very technical thing. An example might be a big youth. If you're adding a youth service, and we're seeing people do that more, a lot more complications in that than just please provide us with £300,000 worth of toilet rolls, for example. So you may have a lot more qualitative assessment of the kind of work they will do, the kind of people they will employ, the kind of initiatives they will bring, rather than just what is it going to cost. So in terms of process, obviously we publish a tender notice saying, here's a tender, this is how you bid for it, and the associated tender document, which is the bit that everybody fills in to send back to you. The minimum timescale is normally 25 days. and those are days, not working days, if you're accepting electronic submission and you've published everything at the same time. If you want paper postal submission, it's 5 more days. If you don't publish the tender notice at the same time as the tender documentation, it's another 5 days. It can be up to 40 days, depending on the circumstances. Can be reduced to 10 days if urgent. That has to be a genuine urgency, not the fact that you forgot to do it in plenty of time. It's not an excuse if you have simply sat on it for 3 months because you weren't sure about what to do. So this is because I've said about the guidance already, this is just a snap. This is just a snap I've taken straight off the government's guidance screen. And this is just a list of the different bits of guidance at the procurement stage. So there's a pre-procurement stage of more guidance, there's a development design stage, there's a post-procurement stage. This is just a list of the separate guidance documents that are available to cover you doing the procurement process. So time periods, publication, exclusions, how to assess competitive tenders, modifying the procurement process, the contract awards and the standstill period that you have to follow, and so on. So each of those leads to a quite lengthy document. Sometimes they're nice and have pictures or charts in them. Sometimes they're just a big list of words, but there's a hell of a lot of guidance. So if you get to a point I don't know, read the guidance is a really good starting point. After the tender process, a slight change in emphasis. We've removed the word economic, most advantageous tender. So it may not be the cheapest, it may be the one that gives the best result overall for your community, for your taxpayers, for your residents. A new burden within this, we must provide an assessment summary to each tenderer, which could be a bind if you do an open tender and get 150 responses. Again, there is a guidance document all about what an assessment summary requires and what that actually means. If you're doing a larger procurement, so if you're doing above threshold procurement, there is a slight difference to kind of your everyday experience of doing tendering and stuff like that. And that is, there is a standstill period. So once you've made a decision that you would like Fred Bloggs to do your work, you publish a contracts award notice, which says, we are going to award this contract to Fred Bloggs. There's then a standstill period of 8 working days. And during that period, you can't do anything. So you can't award the contract, you can't start doing things. That gives anybody who may be aggrieved by your processes the chance to just say, hang on a minute, what's going on? Once you're past that phase and you award a contract to somebody, you must publish a contract details notice within 30 days. And if it's over 5 million, which it probably won't be in most parish council cases, but if you do a contract over 5 million, you must publish the contract itself as well. Before I do the below threshold, you're going to ask the obvious question, where do we publish it? Well, that's the interesting bit, because the legislation says on the there's basically a central purchasing site, but it doesn't name it, specify it. I think what we are expecting to happen is, you may be aware there is find tender, which is for everything above threshold, and contracts finder, which is for below threshold procurement over £30,000. There is no mention of contracts finder anywhere in the Act or the new regulations under the Act. And what we think is going to happen, and the indications coming from the government are, there will be a single site. Whether it will still be called find tender, I don't know, but there'll be a single site which merges both of those. So you'll only have, you as a supplier, you as a purchaser rather, will only have one site to register with and log into. Suppliers will only have one site to look at rather than 2 to find contracts. And if you're looking for those over 200,000, you just use the filters to sort that. And if you're looking for those between 30,000 and 200,000 or whatever, you can filter to use that. So it would just be one site that does everything rather than 2, which has always seemed a bit of an oddity, if we're honest. So below threshold, what difference are? Well, not a huge amount. Again, the requirement to remove barriers to small and medium enterprises is key there. You will, if you're doing an open competition below threshold, i.e. under 214,000, you have to publish a below threshold notice before you invite tenders. if you're going out to everybody. Doesn't apply if you're only choosing your selected list. And at this level, you cannot restrict tenderers based on any kind of assessment of supplier suitability, so a PQQ or something like that, with one exception in there. But at this level, the guidance does say you can invite people directly. You can seek quotes or proposals rather than tenders. You may want to award without competition in certain circumstances. You may want to restrict by area or business size. And below threshold, you have more flexibility. You still have the responsibility to achieve value for money and all the other things. So you can't just award to whoever you fancy without any process of working out whether it's value for money or not, but you are much more flexible. And there are no specified time limits other than you must be reasonable in the terms of doing that. And the final thing, 30-day payment terms, the law implies 30-day payment terms into your contracts, regardless of what you put in them. And I'm going to ignore the evaluation criteria because read the rules on evaluation criteria when you get to that point.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Steve. Do you have a few, we're 4 minutes till 30 minutes past. Do you have extra time above that, Steve?
I'm happy to sit here till you close. I said I'll be half an hour, but to be honest, this room has been, I'm in an empty room. It's been sat empty. There seems to be nobody else wanting to use the room, so it's fine. Can I just pick up second to last question there, which is where are the documents? Exactly where you expect them to be. .gov.uk is where you find stuff from the government. Yeah. And if you put in Procurement Act, it will spew out pages. If you put Procurement Act guidance, you're more likely to find it. So just look where you would think it ought to be there.
Excellent. Also, before we jump into the further questions, I just want to, I mean, Steve never really sells himself at all, but, you know, you're getting a snippet of him today. He's an absolute expert. He does the full training with most association of local councils. So make sure you go onto your association local council websites, have a look if he's doing the full Procurement Act training, amongst all other training on financial accounts. And also make sure you attend. So a lot of people do pay and they don't even attend. And then if you need the extra, like beyond the training, you do consultations as well, like private work, don't you, Steve? If there's a particular challenging financial issue.
We do an awful lot of VAT work. We do an awful lot of financial management work. We don't do procurement for the simple reason the biggest thing I've bought in the last 10 years is probably about £1,000. But interestingly, I had a guy on the session this morning who works for a principal authority as well as being a parish clerk, and he specialises in procurement. So we are going to be having some conversations. But thank you, John, as my marketing man, for plugging me like that.